Hi, that's better. Good evening, 92nd Street. Why? And
Hello.
lovely to be here. Really a great honor for me to be sitting on the stage with Alice and to get a chance to talk with her about Absolution and about her writing in general. And so I'd like to really start, if you don't mind. And is for those who haven't read the book yet, before I ask my first question, I was wondering if you just sort of introduce how you think of your version of introducing the book, of what it's about in the most simple sense, before I dig in.
Whew, that's the rest of the night.
Okay.
Okay, Absolution in some ways is a faux epistolary novel. Two women exchanging memories about time that they spent together, one as a child, one as a newly married American abroad in Saigon in 1963. So the novel really begins before it actually begins. That is, the woman who was the child in Saigon in 63, now as past middle age, has reached out to the woman who was a newlywed and said, "Do you remember me? Do you remember my mother, who was your friend? And do you remember a young GI named Dominic?" That's not actually in the book. That's everything that happens before the book begins, and the book begins with Patricia's recollections in the form of a novel.
Perfect. So my first question is, given the body of your work and given all the different topics that you've written on over time, I'm fascinated about how you choose what to do next, and what got you launched in this effort. What brought you back to Vietnam in 1962 and the desire to tell the story of, particularly around these women at the center of the story. So where did it begin, and how do you kind of, when you're finishing a book, sort of begin the process of figuring out, okay, which one's next?
Well, I always write two at the same time.
Which is absolutely mystifying.
Is a terrible idea. Yeah. If any writers out there, don't do that. Don't ever do that. It's wrong. It just means it takes you twice as long to finish one of them.
Okay.
And it gives you a very good excuse to procrastinate, because you can procrastinate by writing another novel. But don't do it.
So was this being written while you were writing The Ninth Hour? Was it the second book to The Ninth Hour?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and now there's still another.
There's something out there.
Yeah,
okay.
With another.
All right. So years ago, when you launched into the effort of what became Absolution, where was the origin of it for you in terms of the spark that got you thinking about the material?
This actually, Absolution has a very long history in my mind. And I think it began when I first read Graham Greene's The Quiet American.
Okay, yeah.
So I first read Graham Greene's The Quiet American as an English major at Oswego State, up on the shores of Lake Ontario, the coldest spot on earth. And I was not a very serious student, but I liked to read. I had gone to Oswego because I had a Regents scholarship and because it was rated the #3 party school.
You didn't get into #1?
Wasn't in New York.
Okay,
I had to go to school in New York. But so this would have been, the early 70s, 1970, 1971. Obviously, Vietnam was very much on all our minds and had been a part of my own coming of age, not because it touched me personally, but just because it was there, and we were all living through it. And I remember very vividly reading The Quiet American and having two distinct thoughts. One was Graham Greene got it right. Graham Greene was so prescient. The book was written in the early 50s, published in 1955. He foresaw American hubris. He foresaw how little we understood what we were doing, the power plays that would be our downfall. And even as a 19-year-old, I thought, why didn't Eisenhower read The Quiet
Right,
American?
yeah, right.
Why didn't JFK read The Quiet American? Why didn't Nixon and LBJ read The Quiet American? You know, this was in the time when we assumed presidents read books. But it just struck me as unbelievable to read this short novel. We would have learned so much, and I was full of admiration the way Graham Greene was able to foresee what was coming in America's involvement in Vietnam. But 1970 was also the first stirrings of the women's movement. And even as a 19-year-old, I thought, but Graham Greene sure didn't see that coming.
Right, yeah.
Because the women in the novel were flat and uninteresting. The Vietnamese women were either China dolls or shrews. And there were hardly any American novels, except for one scene at a milk bar in Saigon, where Fowler, who's the hardened British journalist who's the narrator, turns and he sees these two young American women, obviously working State Department or whatever, and he thinks of how clean and uncomplicated they look, that you can't even imagine them having any passion. Not like moi, you know, the male narrator who's so complicated. So even as a 19-year-old, I thought, these are two American girls in Saigon in the 1950s. They're actually kind of interesting. I would have loved to have known what they were doing.
Yeah.
So fast forward, I find myself living inside the Beltway outside Washington, D.C., and over the years running into women at cocktail parties and church and volunteering at my kids' school who could have been models for those girls, who had these great and interesting lives, many of them as wives in exotic places, and they would never tell you about it unless you asked them. And when you asked them, they would always say, well, my husband or my boss, my male boss, was doing the interesting things. I was just there as support. I was just there to take care of the kids, to take care of the household, to do the entertaining. And so those two things that, you know, do I really want to go toe-to-toe with Graham Greene? But also, here's a story that hasn't been told. Here's a point of view that hasn't been told. And I tried to find some memoirs, if any such women had ever written a memoir. And they don't, because they were so sure that the story was not, the interesting part of the story was not theirs. Their husbands were out screwing up the world, and they were just taking care of the children, just keeping the household. So I wanted to give voice.
Yeah, and you do depict that moment in time pre the acceleration of feminism, where the young women here, and it's 1964, is it
63.
63, excuse me.
Yeah.
The protagonist, I think, is 23 or about that. It opens this wonderfully described garden party, and where there are four women that are in the scene, as it were, that sort of become the novel in its greater scope. Because you're the protagonist, she meets a very dynamic, charismatic, another wife in the community who's sort of bolder than her, a little older than her. She has a young daughter, the daughter that you mentioned in the setup, who we're going to meet again many years later. And then there's a Vietnamese woman who's a talented seamstress who works in the household. Mm-hmm. But in the depiction of the protagonist, she totally believes that she is there for her husband, and it's a complete 1950s mentality without any sort of hesitancy or irony or cynicism. She is proud, and her identity is tied up in, I am the wife of this important person doing important things. And so I'm sort of interested in how you thought about writing about that in this person who we also know is going to go through the 60s and the 70s, you know, and who was telling the story having done that, but sort of looking back on her younger self, you know. So how did you think about sort of the depiction of sort of that moment in the history of American womanhood, I guess it is. I mean,
Yeah, well, I think in some ways it parallels looking at America's involvement in Vietnam at that moment. And it was important to me not to have the sort of smug wisdom of hindsight. In other words, to understand these characters in their time and place, even though we, smart people who come from the future, know what they believe and what they do is harmful and wrong. But it seemed to me in the moment, in the context of their lives, they don't see it that way yet. So I sort of wanted to give credit to what they believed at that time in their lives and could not have believed otherwise. So I didn't want her to be bitter about the role that she found herself in, and to try to have her see with some sincerity, yes, I know what I've lived through since, but at that moment I loved my husband. I was excited about how he was going to bring us, they're both working class children of immigrants. He's a brilliant lawyer. He's going to bring us into the upper classes. This is where my success was. So when she's married and her father says to her, be the jewel in your husband's crown, we hear that in 2024 and cringe, but she sees it as a worthy career goal.
Yeah, and we accept that beautifully in the way that the telling takes place, because, excuse me, your attention to detail, the fineness of your sentences, your empathy for the protagonist all bring us into seeing the Vietnam through her eyes. You know, I don't think we don't have a jaded view of what she's going through at all, or a cynical view of what she's going through. You know, and that's I think a part of the achievement of the tone of the book. I have two other questions about sort of process, and I want to ask you some other thematic questions. And the first is, recently, and a number of years ago, you said, these days, in an interview, these days, I'd rather start out not knowing what I'm doing, where I'm going. I'm more willing to see where the writing takes me, whereas in the past, I was much more determined to be in control from the start. So no, that sounds to me like you were an outliner and you aren't now, or some version of that.
Well, you're a great outliner,
I'm an
right?
outliner.
Yes.
So then I read that and again, I'm shocked. But so can you talk about that sort of the evolution of that change and sort of how that and in the writing of Absolution, what were the ramifications of that? You know, whatever this change that you went through in the way that you launch your projects.
Yeah, I think part of that may have been all the years I was working with young writers, teaching writing, and seeing, not only in my own experience, but in theirs, let it go. If you're just filling out a form, you're going to lose interest. Reader's probably going to lose interest, and nothing wonderful will happen that you didn't know was going to happen. Yeah. And in some ways, it seems perfectly logical to me now, although I did have to kind of go through that letting go of certainty, because that's why you pick up a book in the first place. I wouldn't read a novel if I knew everything that was going to happen in the novel, and I knew how I was going to feel on every page. You know, the delight, we're all readers first, all of us novelists, and so the delightful thing is when a novel takes you someplace you didn't know you were going to be taken, and helps you to see things you would not have seen otherwise. So in some ways, it's physician, heal thyself. As the writer, you're your own first reader. So there should be some sense of, I don't know where this is going until I do, until I see it.
Is there a point at which that comes into focus for you? Like, you know, I mean, percentages don't matter, but a third of the way through the book, a halfway through the book, or is it right up until the end, or you're still going through discovery in the final, quarter?
I think if there was any point where I thought I got this and it's not the last sentence, I would stop writing.
Okay, is that right? Yeah, very interesting.
I mean, in Absolution, a good example of that, you mentioned Charlene, who is the older corporate wife who takes Tricia under her wing. I did not see her coming initially.
Oh,
she was
yeah.
not planned for.
Wow.
She was having this sense that I wanted to write about these women's lives, and I wanted to look at this past, not only through everything we now know about it, but with some generosity to understand. I think we sort of need to make the effort to understand people who we know are wrong.
Yeah.
How did they get there? And if I were in their shoes, would I also be wrong? So all that going on, but I didn't really have a story. I just had a sense. And then I was actually at a little cocktail gathering with some outside of Washington, D.C., with some women, a little older than I, who had been State Department and military wives. And they started talking about their great seamstresses and what beautiful clothes they bought when they were in the Philippines and even Vietnam back in the 50s and 60s. And then one of them said that the material was so beautiful and it was so inexpensive that when her seamstress left, she would take the scraps and she would sew doll clothes and send them to her nieces in the States.
Yeah. And so that's where that comes from.
So that was the Barbie doll.
Yeah. Start.
So then I thought, okay, I just need to write an origin story for a Barbie doll in 1963 being dressed in an ao dai, a Vietnamese ao dai.
Yeah.
That's all I know about the story.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Start.
Now then I can hear the voice.
Yeah.
Then I can see who's narrating.
Yeah.
And obviously cocktail parties seem very handy.
I wondered if the party was one of the first things you saw. Because it seems like a great opening of a door into an imaginary situation.
You have the American community gathered.
Yeah.
Trisha's husband tells her this is how things get done in Saigon. It's the social, all that partying. I did have a copy editor ask me if women in 1963 really would wear stockings to a party when it's 100 degrees outside. I think the question was, is that historically accurate or is it a metaphor? Said, it's both. So Charlene appeared in the writing, and my first reaction was, I know this character. I know this type, this woman who comes in and takes over, and she's always raising money for something, and she's pushing everybody around.
Were you excited when she showed up?
No, I didn't like her.
Oh, seriously?
Like, oh my gosh, like I know.
She's a great character.
I know this type. Well, then I thought, but I don't like her, but I have to. Now I have to learn who she is, and I have to give her some credit if I can find any.
Yeah. So I'm going to read a quote from you to sort of set up this question, and it is, you're talking about place in your work, and you say that, looking back, New York City, Brooklyn, Long Island, Ireland, all places that you've written about, are of no particular interest to me as actual historical geographic places. But New York and Brooklyn as the immigrant's foothold in a new world, as the landing place, as a metaphor for aspiration, hope, longing, that I can use. And then you say the Long Island suburbs with their green lawns and identical houses as the outward sign of our desire for order and peace, a safe place to raise children, as a metaphor for the insatiable desire for something better, that I can use. So I love this sort of way of thinking about it. My question was sort of, what would be how would you translate that same sentence in essence for Vietnam? What is for you, sort of that list of sort of the abundance of metaphor for you that Vietnam is in your story, Vietnam where the Americans are, in that way that you talk about Brooklyn or Long Island? Yeah,
that's a wonderful question. And it was certainly, again, it's the American community, a place apart, but also, and I think it still is the same. It's not so, for me, it's not so much the place itself or even the history of the place. It's the place through my character's eyes, the place through the narrator's experience of it. And so here's a young woman at the beginning of her marriage, really never been out of New York. She's Irish Catholic from the Bronx. I still had to get my Irish Catholics in there, you know.
There are nuns.
There's nuns. They just keep showing up. But it seemed to me, you know, without a lot of deep thought, that there was a parallel, there was a metaphorical parallel to American hubris, American confidence. We can fix this. We can take care of this country. We can straighten them up and bring them democracy and get rid of the communists, and all will be well. That parallel to a 23-year-old saying, I can do this. I can be the helpmeet. I can be the jewel in my husband's crown. I can entertain the way Charlene does, and I can produce children, because that's my goal in this agreement. I will be a partner who will take care of the household and the children. So there is that same kind of confidence. We can do this. That in a very small way in the relationship between Tricia and her husband and how she sees her future, and then in the larger way of American confidence in ourselves. We were still carrying. You know, the what we had learned in World War II, the self-love and self-regard that we had as Americans. You know, as you know, most of the generals who were running the Vietnam War early on were all World War II guys.
Right.
So easy, right?
Right. No, we know how to do this.
We know how to do this. Yeah.
Both militarily and politically.
Right, and then personally.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was going to say that Charlene kind of is in a sort of in between the two descriptions you just made, and that the main character, as you say, has really a domestic program that you know that she is pursuing, and then you have sort of the America and the war, the coming war. But in between, you have Charlene, who is outside of the scope of her domestic life, is interested in making an impact on the country in some way, and you know, through charitable acts or through visiting a leper colony, through bringing gifts to children at the hospital, and is very entrepreneurial about it in this hilarious way, selling black market drugs in order to fund her good deeds. But so in the context of that, I thought it was interesting. In the book, two sort of moral maxims are raised during a conversation between two of the characters, and the two maxims are. The first comes from the Jewish tradition, and I'm going to mispronounce this, but it's Tikkun Olam, where it is raised as sort of an ideal of moral action.
Repair the world.
Repair the world.
Right.
The translation being repair the world, and Charlene then responds with a Buddhist maxim, which is mend yourself, and she does it in a sort of a somewhat ironic, knowing way, and so I thought that was a very interesting sort of. Suddenly, these two ways of approaching the world, right? Repair the world, to be active in it, making change, or whatever it means to you, versus this Buddhist version of just you should be focused on mending yourself, And so I wanted to hear how you thought about sort of those two poles within the context of this book, as what. As you think about the morality of the themes of the book, how do you think about those issues?
Yeah, and I think it's, and you're absolutely right. Those two things, not so subtly, they're right there. Okay. They're right there.
I'm not saying that.
In the conversation. Yeah, it's repair the world. Go out there and repair the world, which will always be in need of repair, or heal yourself, mend yourself, and. I think that becomes even more complicated for the women, especially of this era. Because if you repair the world, then who's taking care of your children? And so that choice that you have to make, when the two women do go to the leper colony to bring beautiful clothes to the lepers, to show them, in Charlene's words, we will not look away from suffering, that we're here for you.
Yes, right.
and an American doctor comes out of the jungle, and one of the first things he asks Charlene is, where are your own children while you're off doing your good deeds? And it becomes, for Tricia, that sense of, why am I putting my own life at risk to help the helpless, to end suffering, which will never be ended, especially if I'm a mother and there are 2 or 3 people for whom I am the most important person in the world. So what right do I have to put myself at risk in order for this, this global solution or salvation? Or must I stay home and mend myself, take care of my own family? So for this time and place especially, but it's still a question that women get asked. You have children, what are you doing in the jungle? You have children, what are you doing being a nurse in a COVID ward?
I thought it was also nice in terms of, it also sort of sheds light to me on the male activity of the story, in the sense that we've talked about the American confidence that, we can go fix this.
Right.
We're in the fixing business. But on the other hand, you have that sense of the individual hubris or arrogance, which is a mend yourself problem. If those individuals in charge weren't as arrogant internally, they might not pursue the avenues that are actually going to cause a lot of trouble outside the scope of their knowledge.
Right, but the double irony on top of that, and I think this is what Charlene in many ways wrestles with, is, but you don't look away from suffering.
Yes, okay, yeah.
That she makes the case in another conversation, again, she's just trying to raise money, but she and Tricia have lunch with a major's wife doing their fundraising, and the major's wife says, why are you bothering to raise money so that you can bring lollipops and little toys to the children in the hospital here? These children's lives are not going to be made any better by what you're doing. Why don't you just give the money to the American school? We need it, and save the mothers all the trouble that they go to raising funds. And that's when Charlene says the worst thing to do is to look away.
Yeah.
But if you're mending yourself only, aren't you looking away from other suffering?
Yeah, absolutely. And because she says that the willingness to look away is, in a way, it's a small evil.
Right.
And it's because of what it shows we're capable of.
Exactly.
The willingness to turn away from poverty or the lepers or ugliness or, it's the beginning of the possibility of indifference and other things, right?
Right. So do you circle the wagons around your own life and take care of the people for whom you are the most important person in the world, and say, I can't do anything about that out there, so I'm not even going to look at it? Or do you compromise the safety of your little suburban home, which is what it comes down to for Charlene's daughter? Choosing the safety of the suburban home and not have grand ideas about changing the world. So
while we're on this topic more, I'd like to talk about the title for a second. Because Absolution also plays a meaningful role in The Ninth Hour, your last novel, which is really about the working class people and from immigrant backgrounds and nuns in Brooklyn, and fabulous, beautiful novel. But how did you decide to call it Absolution, and what is the absolution for you that are? And I'm sure there's not one, but what is sort of the tenor of absolution for this group of characters in your eyes?
Well, first, I'm not sure that absolution is granted anywhere in the novel.
Maybe sought or hoped for.
Yeah, but I think it's more the seeking of it. Yes, and I think it goes back to this exchange, this faux exchange of letters. I say faux letters. It's a real exchange, but nobody would write a letter that long.
No, of course.
And nobody would read it if
that's
you did.
More like it.
Right.
Someone might write it.
Right, exactly, right. Post office wouldn't have anything to do with it. But there is this sense of seeking Absolution, and trying to understand, again, who you were at that time, how you acted in that context. Could you have acted otherwise, not having the benefit of knowing what the results were, whether for good or bad. And I knew right away, since it was going to be this exchange, right away I'm thinking it's a conversation, but it's also a kind of confession.
Yeah.
And as in the best confessions and conversations, and kind of goes back to your question about outlining and planning ahead, the best conversations, the best confessions are when you end up saying something you didn't know you were going to say.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Exchanging something you didn't know.
Yeah.
We started out talking about something trivial, and 20 minutes later, something is said that neither one of us expected. That's when it gets interesting.
Yes, right.
So I knew, that in so many ways would inform the novel. Not so much to absolve the past, but in the seeking of it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And these two women, I think, both want. For Tricia, I think it's just understand who we were, if you can, to this next generation who knew about the war and what a failure it was.
Yep.
And on Rainey's part, I think it was more because she didn't understand who her mother was. She has a burden of guilt. Yep. Mothers and daughters and guilt, yeah. So I knew that was important, but I'm getting towards the end of finishing the novel, and I had a very dear friend who's no longer with us, who was a priest in the Brooklyn Diocese for many years, Monsignor George, and retired out to East Hampton, and we were out there, and we took Monsignor George out to dinner, and brilliant guy. He studied literature at Columbia, read everything, saw every play, just brilliant, smart, good priest, big heart, beloved by so many people. And Monsignor George said to me, do you have a title for this novel you're finishing? And I'm thinking, here's the expert. This is the guy to run it by. So I said, yeah, well, I'm thinking about calling it Absolution. And Monsignor George was a big guy, and he looked down at me and said, that's a terrible title. And then he said, because nobody really understands what absolution means. And he said, I blame us Catholics, because we give this impression, there's a little box and Catholics go into it, and you can have done the most horrible things. I killed people, I cheated, I stole money. You tell it to the priest, he says a little mumbo jumbo, says, go out and say 2 Our Fathers and 2 Hail Marys, and it's over. And it's not, absolution is not a get out of jail free card. And he talked about the words that the church uses. It's not just I grant you pardon, it's I grant you pardon and peace, which is a really important part of it. And so how do you get the peace?
Yeah.
But then he said, that as far as he was concerned, the best way to understand the root of the word absolution is the phrase to set free. And he told me, think about that phrase, it always involves 2 actors. You can't do it for yourself. To set free involves someone who is set free and someone who sets free. And in that way, it's a very human interaction. In the Catholic Church, it's God and a person. But for the rest of in the rest of the world, it's a very human and very intimate interaction, and that it takes as much grace to give absolution as it takes to receive it, which is sort of. In the months since I've thought about that, it's a complete echo of Portia's speech about the quality of mercy, that it blesses he who giveth as much as he who receives. I mean, it's that simple. But when Monsignor George...
Forgiveness is probably the same way in that regard.
Yes, sure, quality, it's mercy, yeah. But I think we do forget that it's active on both parts, that it does take a tremendous effort to forgive, to be merciful. And it takes a tremendous effort to receive absolution or mercy or forgiveness, if it's done sincerely. And when Monsignor George said this, I was aware, because I was well along in the composition of the novel, I was aware of how much twinning goes on in this story. There are literal twins. Rainey is a twin. And every character, there's Trisha and Charlene, there's the good doctor and the jungle doctor. Every character seems to have a mirror image. So of course I told myself, I know what I'm doing. This isn't just coincidental. It's all about North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and communism and anti-communism, two ways of looking at every issue. And I had convinced myself that I understood how this doubling was working in the novel, but I didn't really understand it until Monsignor George said that.
Walked you through the absolution definition.
Yes.
Fascinating.
Yes. Yeah. And then I realized.
Did you pick up the tab for that lunch, I hope?
I certainly did. And he liked fine food.
All right, so I have one more question for you. So whoever has the questions from the floor, if you can deliver those while I'm asking this, that'd be great. And so this is a strange question, I guess. But so what I want to do, I'm going to read to you two things that you've said and then and a line from the book, okay? And so the first is, in an interview, you said that after writing your first novel, I was aware that I wanted to move closer to what can't be said, toward what can be conjured only through refrain and pattern, which means memory. Sort of this, your sort of progression of looking for this, pursuing what can't be said in fiction. In your essay, What I Expect, which is a terrific essay in her book of essays about what she expects from fiction. Like, what in essence, it's almost like a demand list. This is what I am looking for. And but you say language in fiction must recreate what is intuited but never heard. Language in fiction is obliged to invoke what cannot be said, what Virginia Woolf called the voice of the beauty in the world. And then in the book, I guess this is Dr. Wallace. He's interested in poetry, and he asking a Vietnamese woman about a particular poet, and she says, "Well, no, that's never been in English because it can't be translated." And his response is that poetry is in the world well before a poet finds it. Its source is the unspoken, and the unspoken is always translatable. So I was sort of fascinated by this sort of recurrence of that which can't be said or the unheard, and that that what is unspoken is always translatable. So you, as a writer, committed to the expression through language, but yet are clearly have a very deep interest in sort of what the struggle of what can't be said. So I'd love to hear you talk about that obsession, I guess. Or that, I don't know, that interest. That
can't be said.
Insight, that can't be said.
Yeah, but again, I think as a reader, I guess the simplest way to think about it is any wonderful experience, especially experience that the arts brings to us, but you read a wonderful book and you can't explain it. What makes it wonderful? Yeah. You end up saying you just have to read it. Right. You just had to be there. You just had to have heard it. You just have to stand in front of that painting for 20 minutes. Maybe it will happen, maybe it won't, but it happened to me. So I think it is that, why make up? Why are we making up worlds? The world is there, you know?
Right.
I mean, and it's, there's plenty to say about it. But that idea that fiction, that novels, that falling somewhere between journalism and poetry, maybe hoping to lean more towards poetry, because we have the freedom of creating the characters and creating the situation, and as you say, just using history to our own benefits, rather than having to stick with the way the world has recorded something. What are we aiming for? I think what we're aiming for is pinning down what we know intuitively but fail to say. That language isn't, language gets us there, but there's a wonderful story by Isaac Dinesen called The Blank Page, and it's about storytelling. And the storyteller in that story says that if the storyteller is true to the story, then at the end of the story, the silence speaks. If you haven't been true to the story, the silence is just silence.
Yeah, interesting, yeah.
And that wonderful feeling,
Yep.
When the music stops, when you turn away from the work of art, when you get to the end of a story or a novel, and you know there's something there that you can't simply delineate with language.
Yeah.
And we all know it. I think Tolstoy called it true impressions. That it's something that, now I think it's Bellow who said, it connects us to the universe. And it disappears.
Yeah.
It's brief. But we all recognize it
When we experience
it.
Yeah.
And then it disappears and it leaves us in doubt. And I think it's Bellow who says, we don't know how to talk about it because we would have to say there is a spirit.
Yeah.
And we are reluctant. But we know it when we experience it. And that's what I think fiction is for.
Yeah, terrific, thank you. All right, so these are some questions from the floor. Did you visit and or travel to Vietnam, travel around Vietnam?
I have never been to Vietnam.
Yeah, right.
Now, I thought I would go when I started the novel, and I would feel like a real writer because I would have a tax-deductible trip doing research. But then COVID came along. I needed to write first and get the voice and know who the characters were. And then COVID came along, and I'm not going to Vietnam anytime soon. But then, of course, it's Saigon in 1963.
Yeah.
You can't get there.
Right, no, that's true. You couldn't fly anyway.
No, yeah. Well, it's not, as you know, it's gone.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, no, absolutely.
If it's not in your imagination, it's a disappeared past.
Yeah.
But I did go back to all the Vietnam novels first that I loved. So Tim O'Brien and Dennis Johnson and Robert Stone. Of course, they're mostly war novels, but just to immerse myself, and novels will do that for you.
Yeah.
Immerse myself in the atmosphere of the place.
But it's a great, in this case, because you, having done that reading and about those books about war, you turned your lens and looked in another direction.
Yes.
And I can understand that that's more helpful. Because you don't want to read something that's exactly what you're doing.
No.
You want something that's
already written.
Adjacent.
Why would you do it?
And you can turn and start to imagine what's going on back at home or back
right,
at,
right. It's the and then of course you have to do, as you know, you have to do your research and get your history straight. And but since I had the characters and I had their voices, it's okay. I know this, but would Tricia have known it?
Yeah. You bring up, I was going to mention that somewhere you talk about your mother, who was a great reader, had this great sort of dismissive sentence, which was, it's just nonsense.
A lot of nonsense.
That's a lot of nonsense. So that was her way of, she read a book and you asked her, what did you think of the book? She'd say that, which was just sort of like a complete indictment. And then you interpret it as sort of like, it was particularly around when the book felt inauthentic in some way.
Yes.
The characters were not acting as human beings act. Right. It was sort of this made up for the purpose of the book. She was impatient with that.
A lot of
and that you mentioned that I feel like that's more important than matching the historical record, right? Which is satisfying your mother's desire that the characters act as human beings would in an authentic way.
Exactly.
And I was going to tell you, I am totally going to hear your mother from now on. I guess when I'm reading my own work, I'm going to be, oh man, Alice's mom's going to hate this passage.
Not happy about it.
Cross it out. Okay. Did the theme of looking away and moral indifference change your view about the war and America since then?
Oh, that's a really good question too. I don't know that it changed, but I think probably the most difficult, I don't even know if it's an imaginative leap, but maybe an act of compassion, was to try to understand Trish's husband's belief in what he was doing. Again, because we all know the history of America's involvement in Vietnam is pretty much signed, sealed, and delivered as a mistake. Right. And you can find all the different ways it was a mistake and who lied, but there's not much good to say about it. So trying to, yes, through Trish's eyes, who was sympathetic to what he believed, but also to give him the benefit of truly believing in what he was doing as a CIA agent in Saigon in 1963.
Yeah, interesting, yeah.
So relating that to his faith, that he, being a rabid Catholic and a believing Catholic of that era, truly believed with complete certainty that the Mother of God, the woman who had given birth in the usual way to the Savior of the world, had appeared in Portugal in a grazing field to tell 3 children that Russia must be converted. He believed that happened as solidly as he believed he got up in the morning and got on the subway to go to work. Yeah. And with that kind of faith, and with the sense that of the threat that if this doesn't happen, we will lose our way of life. We will lose everything that we believe in. God will be eliminated. Family will be eliminated. To believe that fully, and then, as Charlene does, well, there may be some nefarious things we have to do for this greater good, but I do believe in the greater good. So reading what I suppose would be right-wing opinions about what was happening in Vietnam from the late 1950s to the early 1960s did give me a different kind of perspective.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, a little bit more compassionate for the people who made the mistake, as it were, made the mistakes you described?
Yeah, well, you know, in the fictional realm, yes.
Okay. Held accountable. This writer says, I enjoyed reading your foreshadowing. Did you add it in after you finished the story, given that you're in an open discovery mode as you go?
Yeah, oh, wow. In some ways, because, you're writing to discover, I don't think of it as foreshadowing. I think of it as a discovery. Yeah.
But do you go back and insert things earlier in the book once you realize, well, this is going to happen later, and I'd like to give a glimpse that this is where it's going to end up?
I don't know that I've ever done that.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I would fear that I would be nonsense. You know, that again, not to set
your mother would be upset about it.
Yes, like you know, you put that, you inserted that clearly. Okay, you didn't see that, but that sense of to discover something as you're composing, to say, now I understand what will happen down the road, so to speak, in the novel.
Thank you. And so this is a question, it's a good one. I was thinking about it myself. This person says, I am from Oswego and also an alumni and a big fan.
Yay!
Can you talk about the symbolism you use in Absolution and the Ninth Hour related to sewing, fabric, and laundry? And you could add dresses, because dresses play a very central role in this book in multiple circumstances.
Yeah.
But so sewing, fabric, laundry, and the 2 novels.
Yeah, it's women's work, very much so. It's also repairing. In the Ninth Hour, definitely. I mean, the nursing sisters in the laundry, they were taking the bloodied sheets and the sheets from the sick room, and as one of the nuns in the novel says, and we transform them. We make them new. We make them clean and fresh again. There's absolution going on in that as well. So very much, it's woman's work. It's just like the copy editor saying, our silk stockings in Saigon. In 1963, when it's 100 degrees, is that a metaphor or is it historically correct? It's what women did, and it's historically correct to dress a certain way. I have heard from so many military wives, and some of them whose experience are not that far off, who've told me about the pressure to dress correctly. Not just the stockings, but the heels, and how your hair is done.
Regardless of the heat and the humidity.
Regardless of everything else, right. Yeah. I had a wonderful letter from a reader who had grew up as a army brat in the Philippines. And he sent me a picture in the early 60s, and he was a little kid in the picture, and there were 4 women behind him, American women, in gowns, because they were always having formal, and big poofy bouffant hair. And he said, yeah, and it was 100 degrees, look what these women are wearing, and they're all also wearing wigs.
Oh.
Because the humidity was so bad and they had so many events that they had to go to that his mother and all her friends had hot boxes with various wigs so that if they didn't have time to go to the hairdresser or if their hair was a mess. So this is what women did, and it's it's as bad as the nuns, being clothed and being barely able to move or to see because of their habits. It was a way of getting along in the world for these women.
The last question is related to what you were just saying, because it is, what has been the reaction to the novel from Vietnam vets and people that were affected by the war, people who live there, et cetera?
It's been... This novel especially, I think I've heard more heartbreaking and complicated stories from vets, again, from military and State Department wives, and from a lot of children of vets, who didn't hear a lot of stories because there wasn't much to be spoken of, that they wouldn't talk about it, again, that keeping it to themselves. But the even more surprising reaction for me is not so much these marvelous stories that people share, but how many women have told me difficult mother like Charlene stories.
Oh, right. Yeah.
My mother was a child of the 50s and the 60s, and she was the jewel in my father's crown. She was the corporate wife who did everything right. She was a beautiful entertainer. She was always dressed impeccably. Her makeup was always right. And I was a child of the 60s and 70s, and I didn't want to shave my legs, and I didn't, and there was a rift that was never healed. And now these women, getting older and saying, I never paused to think what my mother was giving me. I only rejected it. She was giving me what she thought I needed to be a successful woman in the world because it was what she needed in that time and place.
Sure.
And I only rejected it and rejected her without thinking about the inherent value of this valueless thing she tried to give me. That's a story I had not expected, and I've heard in many different versions.
Wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, Alice McDermott, thank you.